Victoria had been working at the boutique for a few years now. It wasn't a demanding job. She mostly handled sales, chatted with customers, and helped with inventory when needed. The boutique was in the nicer part of town, catering to well-off clients who didn't mind spending a little extra. It suited Victoria well, giving her something to do while I handled the bulk of our finances with my job as a project manager. I'd always supported her working there. She liked the freedom, and it was good for her to have something to focus on outside the house. But over the last few weeks, things started to feel different. Victoria's routine had shifted subtly but noticeably. She used to be home by 6, but lately she'd been coming home later, sometimes by an hour or more. Her explanations were always the same. The boutique was busy, or they had to stay late to restock inventory. At first I didn't think much of it. The job could get hectic, especially during sales or when new collections arrived. But there were other changes too. She had begun paying more attention to her appearance, spending extra time on her makeup and hair before leaving for work. Her outfits had become more stylish, more polished. It wasn't like her to go to such lengths for a job where she mainly interacted with middle-aged women and the occasional bored husband. One night, after another late evening, I decided to surprise her by picking her up from work. I figured it would be a nice gesture. We hadn't been out together in a while, and I thought we could grab dinner and talk, maybe reconnect. I arrived at the boutique just before closing time. The place was emptying out, and I could see Victoria inside finishing up with the last few customers. As I parked and walked towards the door, something caught my eye. There was a man inside, well-dressed, standing close to Victoria. Too close. He wasn't like the usual customers I'd seen in there. He had a certain air about him, something that set off alarm bells in my head. They were talking, and Victoria was smiling in a way that made my stomach knot. I watched for a moment, not sure what to make of it. Then I saw her laugh at something he said and touch his arm lightly. It was just a brief touch, but it was enough. The way she looked at him, there was something there, something that made me uncomfortable. I stayed outside watching as they finished their conversation. When she finally walked out, she didn't see me at first. I stepped forward and she nearly jumped when she saw me. "Tommy, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice higher than usual, a nervous edge to it. "I thought I'd surprise you, maybe take you out for dinner," I said, trying to keep my tone light. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but my gut was telling me something was off. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's sweet of you, but I'm exhausted. It was a really busy day." I nodded, even though the unease was gnawing at me. I glanced back at the boutique, but the man was gone. "Who was that guy you were talking to?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Victoria hesitated just for a split second, but I caught it. "Oh, just a customer. He was asking about a dress we had on display." I didn't press her on it, but the way she answered didn't sit right with me. We walked to the car in silence, and as I drove us home, my mind kept replaying the scene in the boutique. That touch on the arm, the way she smiled at him, none of it felt right. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. That night after we got home, I couldn't shake the unease. Victoria acted like everything was normal, but I could tell something was different. She was quieter than usual, avoiding eye contact with me as we ate dinner. Later, when we were in bed, she fell asleep quickly, but I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Something was wrong, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. A few days later, I decided to stop by the boutique again. I told her I had a late meeting at work, but instead, I drove to the boutique and parked a little way down the street where she wouldn't see me. I waited, watching the door as customers came and went. It was a quiet evening, not many people around. After a while, I saw him again, the same guy from before. He walked into the boutique and my heart started pounding. This time I decided to get a closer look. I got out of the car and crossed the street, keeping to the shadows. The boutique's large windows gave me a clear view inside. Victoria was behind the counter, and the man was standing in front of her, leaning on the glass. They were talking, and from where I stood, I could see the way she was looking at him. It wasn't just a friendly chat. There was something more, something I hadn't wanted to admit before. I watched as they talked, and then he handed her something, a small package wrapped in brown paper. She took it, glancing around quickly before tucking it under the counter. My mind was racing with possibilities. What was in the package? Why was she hiding it? The man left shortly after, and I ducked out of sight as he walked past. When he was gone, I waited a few more minutes before heading back to my car. My head was spinning with questions, none of which I had answers to. The drive home was a blur, my thoughts consumed by what I had seen. When I walked in the door, Victoria was already home, acting like everything was normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, I didn't sleep at all. The image of Victoria and that man kept playing over and over in my mind. I knew I had to find out what was going on, but I didn't know how to confront her without causing a fight. I decided to wait to see if she would say something or if anything else would happen. But as the days went by, the tension between us grew, and the distance that had started to form began to feel like a chasm. The next week, things escalated. Victoria's late nights became more frequent, and her excuses less believable. One evening, when she came home late again, I couldn't hold back any longer. "Victoria," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "what's going on with you lately? You've been coming home late almost every night. Is something wrong?" She looked at me, surprised by the directness of my question. "Tommy, it's just work. You know how busy it can get." I shook my head. "It's more than that. I saw you with that guy at the boutique again. Who is he really?" Her face tightened, and for a moment I thought she was going to tell me the truth. But then she forced a laugh. "You're being paranoid. He's just a regular customer." I didn't believe her, but I didn't push it further. I could see the conversation wasn't going to get me anywhere, but I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit by and watch my marriage fall apart. Meanwhile, every night she came home a little later, and every night she brought something new with her. The changes in Victoria were hard to ignore. Every day she seemed more distant, more secretive. She kept bringing home these plain, nondescript bags, which she'd quickly tuck away as soon as she thought I wasn't looking. It bothered me, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I tried to tell myself they were just harmless purchases, clothes maybe, or some new cosmetics. But something deep down told me there was more to it. One afternoon, after she had already left for the boutique, I couldn't take it anymore. The tension had been eating at me, and I had to know what was going on. I waited until she was well into her shift, then I started searching. She'd been stashing these bags in the back of her closet, under a pile of old clothes. When I pulled one out and opened it, my heart sank. Inside was a bottle of intimate lubricant, something we hadn't used in years. My mind started racing. Why would she have this? We hadn't been intimate in months, not since things had started to change between us. There was no reason for her to have this unless she was using it with someone else. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt a mix of anger and despair, but above all, I felt betrayed. I grabbed the bottle, shoved it into my bag, and headed straight for the boutique. My heart pounded the entire drive, my mind replaying every suspicious moment, every late night, every lie. By the time I pulled up to the boutique, I was barely keeping my anger in check. I walked into the store, the bell above the door jangling sharply as I entered. Victoria was behind the counter, and of course he was there. The same guy I'd seen with her before. They were standing close, talking quietly, too absorbed in each other to notice me at first. But when they did, Victoria's face went pale and the man stepped back, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Tommy, what are you doing here?" Victoria asked, her voice high-pitched with surprise. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked straight up to the counter, pulling the bottle out of my bag and slamming it down in front of them. "Explain this," I demanded, my voice cold and hard. The man looked at the bottle, then back at me, his expression shifting from confusion to something else. Fear, maybe, or guilt. Victoria's eyes widened in shock. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "What the hell is this, Victoria?" I snapped, barely keeping my voice under control. "We haven't used this in years. So tell me, why do you have it?" The man took a step back, raising his hand slightly as if to defend himself. "Hey man, I think you've got the wrong idea," he started, but I cut him off. "No, I don't think I do," I said, glaring at him. "You've been hanging around here a lot, giving her gifts, and now this? You really think I'm stupid enough to believe it's all innocent?" Victoria finally found her voice, but it was shaky. Tommy, you're overreacting, she said, trying to sound firm but failing. He's just a customer. We've been going through a rough patch, and he was just being nice, that's all. Nice? I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You call this nice? You've been sneaking around lying to me, and you expect me to believe this is just business? Don't insult my intelligence, Victoria. The man started edging towards the door, clearly realizing he was in over his head. I noticed and took a step towards him, my anger boiling over. Get out, I growled. Get out and don't ever come near my wife again. He didn't need to be told twice. He practically ran out of the boutique, the door slamming shut behind him. I turned back to Victoria, who was still standing there, looking like she didn't know whether to defend herself or break down. Tommy, please, it's not what you think, she said, her voice trembling. I swear nothing happened. He's just been kind, that's all. I stared at her, feeling the last shreds of trust slipping away. Kind, I echoed, my voice heavy with disbelief. You really expect me to believe that? You've been lying to me for weeks, bringing home his gifts, hiding them from me, and now this. I pointed at the bottle again. We haven't been close in months, Victoria. So why the hell would you have this? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us filled with all the things that neither of us wanted to say. Finally, I shook my head, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I don't care anymore, Victoria. Stay with him. Stay with your customer. I'm done. I don't know you anymore. With that, I turned and walked out of the boutique, leaving her standing there. As I got into my car and drove away, I didn't feel the satisfaction I thought I would. The drive home was a blur. My hands were gripping the steering wheel tighter than they needed to be, my knuckles white against the black leather. The bottle of lubricant sat in the passenger seat, a grim reminder of everything that had just unraveled. I couldn't stand the sight of it anymore. As I neared home, I pulled over at a gas station, grabbed the bottle and tossed it into the trash can. I watched as it disappeared into the pile of garbage, feeling a strange sense of finality. It was just a bottle, but it represented so much more. Everything that had gone wrong, everything that couldn't be fixed. As I got back into the car, I noticed something that hadn't registered before. I was still wearing the same clothes I had thrown on that morning, in too much of a hurry to think straight. My shirt was wrinkled, and there was a faint stain on the sleeve, probably from breakfast. I should have changed before confronting Victoria at the boutique, but it hadn't crossed my mind until now. It seemed insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it was just one more sign of how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. I had more important things to deal with now. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. It rang twice before a familiar, gravelly voice picked up on the other end. Tommy, what's going on? It was my lawyer, Bill. He was in his late 60s, semi-retired, but still sharp as a tack. I had hired him a while back when I started sensing that things weren't right. I knew this day might come, and I wanted to be prepared. Bill, it's time, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I need you to prepare the papers. There was a brief pause on the other end, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind. So it's come to that, huh? What happened? I took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. I caught her today. She's been seeing someone, one of her customers at the boutique. I confronted them, and it's clear there's no going back. I want to file for divorce as soon as possible. Bill sighed, but there was no surprise in his voice. I'm sorry to hear that, Tommy, but we'll get through this. I'll start working on the papers right away. Are you sure this is what you want? Yeah, Bill, I'm sure. There's no fixing this. All right, I'll have everything ready for you to sign by tomorrow. We'll move quickly, get this done clean and fast. Thanks, Bill, I said, feeling a weight lift slightly off my shoulders. At least I wasn't completely alone in this. We hung up and I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the phone. I had always known that Bill would be the one I'd call if it ever came to this. But now that the call was done, the finality of it started to sink in. This was really happening. By the time I got home, the anger that had fueled me earlier had drained away, leaving only a dull numbness in its place. I felt calm, almost eerily so, as I went through the motions of putting my things away, changing out of the clothes I should have changed earlier. I had just finished when I heard the door open and Victoria walked in. She arrived barely 10 minutes after I did, her face flushed, but not with worry or panic, more like mild irritation. She seemed more put out by the fact that I had confronted her than anything else. I watched as she set her purse down and kicked off her shoes, acting like this was just another evening. She turned to me, eyes narrowing slightly. "Where did you put that bottle?" she asked, her tone more annoyed than anything else. I looked at her, feeling a cold detachment settle over me. "I threw it away," I said simply. "We don't need it." Victoria frowned, clearly disappointed. "Why would you do that?" "It was a very high-quality lubricant made from premium ingredients. We could have tried it, you know." I stared at her, not quite believing what I was hearing. "Tried it?" I echoed, my voice flat. "I don't want to try anything with you, Victoria. Not anymore." For a moment she seemed taken aback, like she hadn't expected me to say that. But then she just shrugged, her indifference almost infuriating. "Well, suit yourself, but it was a waste to throw it away." I couldn't take it anymore. The numbness I had felt since leaving the boutique suddenly evaporated, replaced by a sharp, almost painful clarity. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I'm going out," I said, my voice clipped. Victoria looked at me, a hint of confusion finally crossing her face. "Where are you going?" "To the Lake Erie embankment," I replied, not bothering to explain further. The truth was, I just needed to get away, to clear my head and put some distance between us. I couldn't stand being in the same room with her right now. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, not waiting for her response. As I passed her, I didn't say another word, didn't look back. I could feel her eyes on me, but I didn't care. As I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, I took a deep breath of the cool evening air. It felt like the first real breath I'd taken all day. I started walking, heading toward the embankment, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Victoria didn't follow me, and for once I was glad. She probably thought this was just another one of our arguments, something we'd work through eventually. I parked myself on a bench overlooking Lake Erie, the cool breeze coming off the water providing a slight relief from the heat in my head. I needed this time alone just to sit and think, or better yet, not think at all. All I had to do now was wait. Bill was already preparing the divorce papers, and once they were ready, I'd double-check everything and file them as soon as possible. For now, I could rest, even if my mind was far from peaceful. As I stared out at the water, trying to find some calm, I noticed a figure approaching in the distance. At first, I couldn't make out who it was, but as he got closer, I recognized the face. My heart sank as the familiar figure came into view. It was Morton, Victoria's uncle. Of all the people I didn't want to see right now, Morton was at the top of the list. He was her mother's younger brother, and though I'd never been particularly close with him, we'd crossed paths enough times over the years. He was a tall, imposing man, with a stern look that seemed to be permanently etched on his face. I knew him well enough to guess why he was here, and the thought of having to deal with him made my stomach churn. As he got closer, I saw the determined look in his eyes. There was no avoiding this conversation. I braced myself as Morton walked right up to the bench and stood there for a moment, looking down at me. "Tommy," he said, his voice gruff but with an attempt at politeness. "Mind if I sit?" I didn't bother replying, just nodded slightly. He took a seat beside me, the bench creaking under his weight. There was a heavy silence between us, the tension almost palpable. I could feel him sizing me up, trying to figure out the best way to approach whatever it was he wanted to say. "I had a call from Victoria," he started, his tone measured as if he was choosing his words carefully. "She told me about what happened today." I didn't respond, just kept my eyes fixed on the horizon. I had thought Victoria didn't fully grasp the seriousness of what had happened, that she might still believe I would forgive her, that things could somehow go back to normal. But apparently she understood enough to realize that she was on the verge of losing everything. And when faced with the prospect of being forced out, she'd done the only thing she could think of, call her uncle. Morton went on, his voice taking on a more conciliatory tone. "Look, Tommy, I get that you're upset. What happened was unfortunate. But Victoria's family, and she's in a tough spot right now. She needs somewhere to stay, and frankly, her parents aren't in any shape to take care of her. You know how it is. Victoria was a late child, and they're getting on in years. They've got hired help looking after them. But even that's something you've been helping with." I nodded slightly. I had been paying part of the salary for her parents' caregivers, more out of obligation than anything else. They were elderly, and I didn't want them to suffer because of what their daughter had done. But that didn't change the situation between Victoria and me. Morton continued, clearly trying to keep the conversation civil. "I'm not saying what she did was right, but I'm asking you as family to reconsider. Maybe you don't need to go through with this divorce. Or if you do, at least let her stay in the house for a while until she figures things out. She's got nowhere else to go, and it wouldn't be right to put her out on the street." I finally turned to look at him, my expression hardening. "Morton, is everything okay with you?" I asked, my voice steady but laced with anger. "My wife has been cheating on me. She's been sneaking around behind my back, lying to me for God knows how long. And now you're asking me to just put up with it, to let her keep living in my house after everything she's done?" Morton's face tightened, but he tried to stay calm. "I'm not asking you to forgive her, Tommy, but you've been married a long time. Maybe you could work something out, at least for now. Divorce is a big step. Are you sure you want to go through with it?" "I'm sure," I replied firmly. "And even if I wasn't, after what happened today, I couldn't live with her under the same roof. Every time I look at her, I see everything she's done. There's no fixing this." Morton sighed, realizing his gentle approach wasn't getting through. His tone shifted, becoming more pointed. "You know, Tommy, maybe you're being too sensitive about this. A real man would have handled things differently. You couldn't keep your wife satisfied, so she looked elsewhere. That's on you, not just her. Maybe you need to man up and deal with the consequences." I could feel my anger rising, but I kept it in check. "You think I should just accept this? Pretend it didn't happen, let her keep on like nothing's changed? Is that what you're telling me?" "Yeah, maybe it is," Morton shot back, his voice now openly confrontational. "Maybe you need to toughen up, Tommy. Stop whining and deal with the fact that she found someone else because you couldn't keep her happy. You're weak, and that's why you're in this situation. You're going to throw her out because you can't handle it? Pathetic." I stood up, unable to stay seated any longer. "You need to leave, Morton," I said, my voice cold. "I'm not going to change my mind, and I sure as hell don't need your advice on how to handle my marriage." Morton stood as well, squaring his shoulders as if he was ready for a fight. "Just try to go through with it, Tommy," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You'll see what happens. You think this is the end of it? You're wrong." He turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the pavement. I watched as he made his way back up the path, and that's when I noticed Victoria standing nearby. She had been close enough to hear everything. Her face was pale, and she looked shaken. Morton reached her and said something in an emotional, almost frantic manner, his hands gesturing wildly. After a moment, he got into his car and drove off, leaving Victoria standing there alone. She hesitated for a moment, then started walking toward me. I could see the uncertainty in her eyes as she approached, like she was trying to figure out what to say. When she finally reached me, I didn't give her a chance to start. "Did you tell him this?" I asked, my voice flat. "Yes," she admitted, her voice quiet. "What a fool I am. What should I do now?" She paused, looking lost for a moment, then asked again, "Am I going to have to leave our house?" I met her gaze, my expression hard. "Yes," I said firmly, leaving no room for doubt. Victoria looked down. She probably thought this was just a rough patch, something we'd get through eventually. "Tommy, I literally have nowhere else to go," she said, her voice trembling. "Morton is the only family I have left, and he already has a wife and 2 teenage kids. How am I supposed to fit in there? What am I going to do?" I looked at her, feeling a cold detachment that I didn't know I was capable of. "God knows," I replied flatly. "And by the way, soon I'll be done paying for your parents' caregivers. I'll finally have money to invest in myself, instead of wasting it on those old peeps." Her face crumpled and she started to cry, the tears streaming down her cheeks. Maybe it was because I had referred to her parents that way, but I couldn't bring myself to care, not after everything that had happened. Don't cry, Victoria, I said, my voice devoid of sympathy. Maybe you should look on the internet. I'm sure there are some programs for the homeless in Ohio. She stared at me, her tears momentarily forgotten as she tried to comprehend what I had just said. How can you be so stony? She asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and despair. I shrugged, the indifference still weighing heavily on me. I learned it from you. Victoria looked like she wanted to say something, but I cut her off. I want to walk. Don't follow me. We have nothing more to talk about. With that, I stood up and walked away from her, heading down the path along the lake. The wind off the water was sharp, stinging my face as I walked, but I didn't care. As I walked, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw that it was my son, Chris, calling from Philadelphia. He was in his final year of medical school at the Thomas Jefferson Institute, working tirelessly to earn his master's degree. It hadn't been easy for him, and paying for his education had been a struggle, even with the successful business my parents had built and managed so well. It was their hard work that had made Chris's education possible, and for that, I was grateful. I answered the call, trying to push the turmoil in my mind aside. "Hey, Chris." "Dad," he said, sounding tired but relieved. "I just wanted to let you know that I'm finally done with all my exams. It was a grind, but I managed to pass everything. I'm officially free for the holidays." I smiled, feeling a brief flicker of pride amidst the mess of emotions swirling inside me. "That's great news, son. I'm proud of you." "Thanks, Dad. I'm looking forward to coming home and seeing everyone. It's been a while." There was a pause, and I knew I had to tell him what was going on. There was no point in keeping it from him, not when he was going to find out soon enough. "Chris," I started, choosing my words carefully, "there's something you should know. Your mother and we're getting a divorce." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head as he processed what I had just said. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying a mix of surprise and resignation. "Wow, that's some fun going on there. It's a shame I'm missing all of this, but I hope you made the right choice, Dad." "I did, Chris," I replied, though my voice sounded more certain than I felt. "It's the only choice I could make." "Well, I'll be home soon," he said, a hint of weariness creeping into his voice. "I guess we'll have a lot to talk about when I get there." "Yeah," I agreed. "We will." We said our goodbyes, and I hung up the phone, stuffing it back into my pocket. I kept walking, my thoughts now a tangled mess of everything that had just happened, everything that was still to come. Chris would be home soon, and we'd have to deal with the fallout of this mess together. But at least he was old enough to understand, to process it in his own way. As I reached the end of the embankment, I turned around and started heading back. When I finally reached the bench where I had left Victoria, she was still there, sitting with her head bowed, staring at the ground. She looked up as I approached, her eyes red and puffy from crying. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the silence between us heavy with all the things that had gone unsaid. "Our son will be home soon," I said finally, breaking the silence. She nodded, her voice flat as she replied, "Okay." There was a pause, and then she looked up at me with a tired expression. "Will you take me home? We're still married after all." I didn't argue with her. I didn't have the energy for another fight. "All right," I said, and without another word, we started walking back to the car. We returned home around 5 p.m. Victoria didn't say much on the drive back, and neither did I. We settled into an uneasy routine over the next few days. I avoided unnecessary conversation with Victoria, and she seemed to be walking on eggshells, unsure of what to say or do. Then, one day, as I was driving through town, I happened to pass by Victoria's workplace. It wasn't intentional, just one of those things that happened. I wasn't planning on stopping, but something made me slow down as I approached the boutique. That's when I saw them. Victoria and that guy sitting on a bench outside. But it wasn't just the closeness that got to me. It was the way he touched her. His hand on her breast, then sliding down to her stomach, resting on her leg. The way she leaned into him, not a care in the world. They didn't see my car at first, but when I slowed down a bit more and they caught sight of me, Victoria jumped up like she'd been burned. She quickly pulled away from him, her face flushed with guilt. I couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh, more like the kind that comes from the sheer absurdity of it all. A few days later, I received the call I had been waiting for. Bill's voice came through the line, steady and professional as always. "Tommy, the documents are ready. You can come by the office to review and sign them whenever you're ready." The news hit me harder than I expected. It was one thing to talk about the divorce, to know it was coming, but hearing that the papers were ready made it all feel real. "Thanks, Bill," I replied, my voice flat. "I'll be there this afternoon." We agreed on a time, and I hung up the phone, staring at it for a moment longer than necessary. I left the house quietly, not bothering to tell Victoria where I was going. She was in the kitchen making herself a cup of coffee, completely unaware that I was about to take the next step in severing our marriage. I didn't feel the need to explain myself. There was nothing left to say. At Bill's office, I went through the documents with him, carefully checking each page. Everything was in order, just as I expected. I signed the papers, the finality of it all settling in as I watched my signature take shape. Bill reassured me that the process would move quickly now, and I could see the relief in his eyes. He knew how much I wanted this over with. When I returned home, I found Victoria sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She didn't notice me at first, and when she finally did, she looked up with a question in her eyes. But she didn't ask. I wasn't sure if she already knew where I'd been, or if she was just too afraid to ask. 2 more days passed, and finally, Chris arrived from Philadelphia. The atmosphere in the house was tense, but we managed to keep things civil, at least on the surface. We didn't talk much about what was happening between Victoria and me. Chris was smart enough to know that something was wrong, but I didn't want to burden him with the details. One afternoon, Chris and I went shopping to update our wardrobes. It was something we used to do together when he was younger, and it felt good to have that normalcy, even if everything else in my life was falling apart. We came back home, bags in hand, and I felt a strange sense of calm, like maybe things would start to get better. But as soon as I stepped inside the house, something felt off. There was a smell, faint but familiar. It took me a moment to place it, but then it hit me. It was the same smell as that lubricant I had found and thrown away weeks ago. I froze, the bag slipping from my hands. "Chris, wait outside," I said, my voice steady, but my heart was pounding. He looked at me, confused, but nodded and stepped back outside. I walked through the house, the smell growing stronger as I climbed the stairs to the second floor. My mind was racing, but I tried to keep it under control. I reached the bedroom door and pushed it open. There, on the bed, was Victoria. She was completely naked, lying on her right side, her back to me, and behind her, on his side as well, was that guy. He was pushing himself into her, completely absorbed in the act, neither of them noticing me standing in the doorway. I didn't feel anger or even disgust, just a cold, empty detachment. "You could have at least waited until we were divorced," I said calmly. They both jumped at the sound of my voice. Victoria scrambled to cover herself with a towel while the guy nearly fell off the bed in his haste to get up. He grabbed his clothes, fumbling to put them on, his face a mask of panic. I watched him, my expression unreadable. "Since you like being with her so much," I said, my voice flat, "why don't you let her live with you? You can have her all to yourself." He didn't say a word, just grabbed the rest of his things and bolted out of the room like a bullet. Victoria, now wrapped in the towel, looked at me with a mixture of fear and shame, but I couldn't bring myself to feel anything for her anymore. "Get dressed," I told her, my voice still calm. "Chris will be here soon, and he's going to be a lot more emotional about this than I am." She nodded numbly and started pulling on her clothes, her hands shaking. I turned and walked downstairs, stepping outside to find Chris waiting by the car. He looked at me, concerned. "What's going on, Dad?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "She was cheating on me, Chris," I said simply. "That guy was upstairs with her just now." Chris's eyes widened, then narrowed in anger. "Was that him?" he muttered. "God, her taste in men is terrible." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief that he was taking it this way. "Yeah," I agreed. "This whole thing just proves that she can't live on her own. She needs a man around, someone to take care of her. But me, I'm fine on my own." We stood there for a moment in silence, both of us processing everything in our own way. Then I turned back towards the house. "Let's go inside." As we walked in, Victoria was standing in the hallway, fully dressed but looking defeated. She met my eyes, then looked away quickly. "Why aren't you at work?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Because we're practically divorced now," I replied coolly. "I didn't think it was necessary to tell you that I got promoted. I do all my work remotely now. Instead of working, I went to the store with our son to update my wardrobe." She stared at me, clearly stunned by the news, but I didn't wait for her to respond. I walked past her, heading for the living room. A couple of weeks later, the divorce was finalized. I didn't force her out of the house right away, but I didn't need to. Every day I reminded her of what she had done, sometimes with words, sometimes with a cold, hard look. Chris helped too, his disappointment in her clear in every interaction. In the end, she packed her things and left, moving in with that lover of hers. I watched her go without a word, knowing that I was finally free. The summer was drawing to an end, and with it, the lingering warmth of those long days began to fade. Chris had spent most of the season back home enjoying the break before returning to Philadelphia. He had earned his diploma, but he was well aware that his medical journey was just beginning. Years of grueling practice and specialization still lay ahead. As for me, life had settled into a new routine. Working remotely had its perks, especially now that I didn't have to worry about the financial drain of supporting Victoria or paying for her parents' caregivers. The extra money had started to accumulate, and I'd begun saving up for a new car. I hadn't yet decided which one to buy, but it was a nice problem to have, one that I could afford to take my time with. I didn't hear much about Victoria or her lover after the divorce. They'd vanished from my life as quickly as they had disrupted it. I assumed she had moved in with him, but I didn't spend much time thinking about it. A few days ago, though, I received an unexpected call from Morton, Victoria's uncle. I hadn't heard from him since that tense encounter at the lake, and I was surprised he even bothered to reach out. His voice was tight, clearly dissatisfied, but there was no reproach in his tone, just a kind of resigned frustration. "Tommy," he began, not wasting any time on pleasantries, "I thought you should know what's been going on with Victoria." I didn't respond, just waited for him to continue. I wasn't sure what he expected me to do with the information, but I was curious enough to listen. "She's told me about the situation with that lover of hers," Morton went on, his voice tinged with annoyance. "Apparently, after they realized they didn't have to hide anymore, they started having sex nearly every day. But it didn't last long. The guy got bored of her, tired of her really, and threw her out. It didn't even last a month." I wasn't surprised. "And now?" I asked, though I could already guess the answer. Morton sighed heavily, the sound of a man who was more burdened than he'd like to be. "Now she's living with me," he admitted. "She had nowhere else to go, and as I feared, she's been a constant headache ever since. My wife's at her wit's end, and the kids, well, they're not too thrilled about it either. They keep asking why she's here, what she's doing in our house. It's like she's brought this storm of negativity with her." I could picture it all too clearly. "Tommy," he said calmly, "if you ever find her homeless on the street, just know it's not my fault." He let out another sigh, this one more resigned. "And there's more. After you stopped paying for her parents' caregivers, they obviously couldn't keep up with the expenses. The caregivers left shortly after, and her parents, well, they've been left to their own devices. I don't know how much longer they have left, considering the state they're in now. And honestly, I don't want to get involved in that mess either." I felt a pang of guilt at the mention of her parents, but it quickly dissipated. "I don't blame you," I said, my voice steady. "It's not your responsibility." Morton didn't argue. He knew as well as I did that this was a situation no one wanted to deal with. "Anyway, I just thought you should know," he said finally. "I don't expect you to do anything about it, but, well, it's where things stand." "Thanks for letting me know," I replied, though I wasn't sure I meant it. We exchanged a few more words, mostly out of politeness, before hanging up. A few weeks later, Chris returned to Philadelphia to continue his studies. We had spent a lot of time together over the summer, and I was grateful for his presence.